The note landed on the table like a whisper that refused to die. For 3 seconds, the most powerful man in America, worth more than some countries, couldn't breathe. His hands trembled as he unfolded the paper, and when he read the 6 handwritten words inside, tears began to fall. Not in a penthouse overlooking Manhattan, not in a private jet above the clouds, but in a diner that smelled like burnt toast and broken dreams, where the linoleum stuck to your shoes and the coffee tasted like regret. Marion's Diner sat wedged between a tire shop and a shuttered antique store on the eastern edge of Charleston, South Carolina. The kind of place where the fluorescent lights hummed a tired melody and the rain outside tapped against the windows like it had nowhere else to go. It was 6:30 in the morning, and the world outside was gray and heavy with spring storm clouds. Inside, the air carried the scent of hash browns sizzling on a flat-top grill, the sharp bite of burnt coffee that had sat too long on the burner, and something sweeter, artificial vanilla syrup from the dispenser that never quite closed all the way. The booths were cracked red, vinyl patched with duct tape. The counter stools wobbled. Everything about the place whispered survival, not success. And yet there he sat, Gideon Hale, billionaire, founder and CEO of Hale Industries, a tech empire that stretched from Silicon Valley to Wall Street and back again. His Navy suit was tailored to perfection, his watch worth more than most people earned in a year. But his face told a different story. It was pale, haunted, like a man who'd spent the night staring at ghosts he couldn't name. And across from him, holding a coffee pot with hands that hadn't stopped shaking since her alarm went off, stood Eliza Bennett, 26, tired, and wondering how a single piece of paper could make a man like that cry. He had walked in 20 minutes earlier, and the diner had gone silent. Not the kind of quiet that comes from politeness, but the heavy, suffocating kind that wraps around your throat and squeezes. The bell above the door had chimed, a cheerful, out-of-place sound. And then everything stopped. The line cook, Ramon, had paused mid-flip with a spatula hovering over scrambled eggs. Old Mr. Kellerman, who came in every morning for black coffee and a blueberry muffin, had looked up from his newspaper and forgotten to blink. Even the jukebox in the corner seemed to lower its volume, as if it too understood that someone important had just entered. Gideon Hale didn't acknowledge any of it. He moved through the diner like a man walking through a memory he'd rather forget. His eyes scanned the room, once cold, analytical, the kind of gaze that calculated worth in seconds. And then he slid into the farthest booth by the window, the one with the cracked vinyl seat and the view of the rain-soaked parking lot. He didn't ask for a menu, didn't ask for anything. He just sat there, staring out at the storm clouds gathering over the old church across the street. Everyone knew who he was. You didn't live in Charleston without hearing the name Hale. The family had built an empire on steel and ambition in the 1950s, then pivoted to technology when the world shifted beneath their feet. Gideon's grandfather had been ruthless. His father had been a ghost, disappearing under mysterious circumstances 30 years ago, leaving behind rumors and unanswered questions. And Gideon himself? He was the cold heir who turned the company into something untouchable. A man who rarely appeared in public. A man who, when he did, commanded silence without saying a word. Eliza had been wiping down the counter when he walked in, and her first instinct had been to stay invisible. She had enough problems without adding a billionaire to the list. Her rent was 2 weeks overdue. The electric bill sat unopened on her kitchen table because she already knew what it said. And her grandmother, Ruth, was lying in a hospital bed across town, her breathing shallow, her words fewer every day. The doctor said it was pneumonia, but Eliza knew better. Ruth was dying from something deeper, something that had been eating at her for decades. And then there were the envelopes, the ones Ruth kept in a wooden box beneath her bed, wrapped in a faded blue ribbon. Eliza had found them 3 days ago while searching for Ruth's insurance papers. Letters, photographs, a folded piece of paper with handwriting that looked like it had been written in a hurry. Ruth had grabbed her wrist when she'd asked about them, her grip surprisingly strong for a woman so frail. "Promise me," Ruth had whispered, her voice like gravel scraping glass. "Promise me you'll give it to him if he ever comes back." Eliza hadn't understood. She still didn't. But when Gideon Hale walked into Marion's Diner that morning, something in her chest tightened. Ruth's words echoed in her mind. "If he ever comes back." She picked up the coffee pot, her hands trembling, and walked toward his booth. Every step felt like walking toward the edge of something she couldn't see. She stopped beside his table, and for the first time, he looked up at her. His eyes were blue, not the warm kind, but the pale, icy blue of a winter sky. They held no warmth, no recognition, just exhaustion. "Coffee?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He nodded once. She poured, careful not to let the pot shake, and then she did something she couldn't explain. She reached into her apron pocket, pulled out the folded note Ruth had made her carry for 3 days, and slid it across the table. For a moment, Gideon didn't move. The note sat there between them like a living thing, its edges worn soft from being folded and unfolded too many times. Steam rose from the coffee cup in lazy spirals, curling toward the flickering neon sign above the counter that read Marion's in faded pink letters. The rain outside picked up, drumming against the windows in a rhythm that felt too loud, too insistent. Eliza stepped back, her pulse hammering in her ears. She didn't know what the note said. Ruth had sealed it before handing it to her, her eyes wet with tears. "Don't read it," Ruth had whispered. "Just give it to him. He'll know." Gideon's hand moved slowly, almost reluctantly, toward the paper. His fingers were long, elegant, the kind of hands that signed billion-dollar contracts and never touched anything ordinary. But when they closed around the note, they trembled, just slightly, just enough for Eliza to notice. He unfolded it with the care of someone defusing a bomb. His eyes scanned the handwriting once, twice, and then his entire body went rigid. The color drained from his face. His jaw tightened. His breath caught somewhere deep in his chest and refused to come out. The note read, "I know what your grandmother did to my mother." 6 words. That was all it took. 6 words written in ink that had faded to a pale gray, in handwriting that looked achingly familiar. Handwriting that matched the letters his father used to receive every Christmas. Letters that always arrived in plain white envelopes with no return address. Letters that his father would read alone in his study, his face pale, his hands shaking. Letters that stopped coming the year his father disappeared. Gideon's vision blurred. The diner around him, the cracked vinyl, the humming lights, the smell of burnt coffee, faded into a haze. All he could see was the note. All he could feel was the weight of decades pressing down on his chest like a stone. He looked up at Eliza, and for the first time in years, his mask cracked. The cold, analytical gaze was gone. In its place was something raw, something afraid. "Where did you get this?" His voice was barely audible, rough and broken, like a man who'd forgotten how to speak. Eliza took a step back, her own fear rising. She hadn't expected this, hadn't expected the most powerful man in America to look at her like she'd just handed him his own death sentence. "My grandma," she said, her voice shaking. "She told me to give it to you. She said it was time." Gideon's hand closed around the note, crumpling it slightly. His other hand gripped the edge of the table, so hard his knuckles turned white. "Your grandmother," he repeated slowly, as if testing the words. "What's her name?" "Ruth," Eliza whispered. "Ruth Delaney." The name hit him like a freight train. Delaney. Margaret Delaney. The woman his grandmother had destroyed in a business deal that was never spoken about. The woman whose name appeared in whispers and old legal documents buried in archives. The woman whose daughter had vanished without a trace. Gideon pressed the note to his chest, his breath coming in short, shallow gasps. And then for the first time in 30 years, tears began to fall. Silent, unstoppable, carving tracks down his face like rivers breaking through a dam. Outside, thunder rolled across the Charleston sky. The neon sign flickered. And in that moment, the empire of Hale Industries, built on secrets and silence, began to unravel. Sleep didn't come. Gideon had returned to his suite at the Belmont Hotel, a historic building overlooking the Charleston harbor, where visiting dignitaries stayed and where silence cost extra. The room was pristine. White linens, dark wood furniture, a view of the water that most people would call breathtaking. But Gideon saw none of it. He sat on the edge of the bed, still wearing his wrinkled suit, the note clutched in his hand like a lifeline to a drowning man. The memories came in fragments sharp and jagged, cutting through the careful walls he'd built over 3 decades. He was 12 again, standing outside his father's study at the family estate in Boston. The door had been closed, but voices leaked through. His father's low and strained, his grandmother's cold and clipped like the snap of winter branches. "You will not disgrace this family," she'd hissed. "That woman means nothing. Do you understand me?" Nothing. His father had said something Gideon couldn't hear. And then silence. Final. 2 weeks later, his father was gone. No goodbye. No explanation. Just an empty chair at the dinner table and his grandmother's tight-lipped insistence that he'd gone abroad on business. The police had investigated briefly, but the Hale name carried weight. Questions faded. Files closed, and Gideon learned to stop asking. But the letters had continued. Every Christmas, plain white envelopes with no return address. His father had kept them in a locked drawer in his study, and after he disappeared, Gideon's grandmother had burned them. All of them. He'd watched from a hallway as she fed them into the fireplace one by one, her face expressionless, her movements methodical. All except one. A photograph had slipped from the last envelope before the flames could claim it. Gideon had grabbed it when she wasn't looking, hiding it beneath his mattress like a stolen treasure. He still had it, kept it in a safety deposit box in New York, though he hadn't looked at it in years. The photograph showed 2 women standing in front of a small storefront. Both were young, maybe in their 20s, arms around each other, smiling like they shared a secret the rest of the world would never understand. One of them was his grandmother, tall, elegant, her eyes bright with something that looked almost like joy. He'd only ever known her as cold and calculating, so seeing her like this had always felt wrong, like looking at a stranger wearing her face. The other woman was labeled on the back in faded pencil. Margaret Delaney, 1962. The edge of the photograph was singed, burned, as if someone had tried to destroy it, but stopped at the last second. Gideon stood and walked to the window. The harbor stretched out below, dark and endless. Somewhere out there, answers existed. Somewhere in this city, Ruth Delaney was lying in a hospital bed, holding on to secrets that had outlived the people who created them. He pulled out his phone and dialed a number he knew by heart. It rang twice before a gravelly voice answered. "Julian," Gideon said quietly. "I need you in Charleston. Now." "What's going on?" Gideon looked down at the note, the ink smudged now from his grip. "I need you to find someone. Her name is Ruth Delaney, and I need to know everything about her mother." There was a pause. Then Julian's voice, careful and measured. "Gideon, are you sure you want to go down this road? I don't have a choice anymore." He hung up and stared out at the darkness. Somewhere in the distance, lightning flickered. The storm wasn't over yet. Eliza sat in the plastic chair beside her grandmother's hospital bed, her hands wrapped around a cup of cold coffee she'd forgotten to drink. The room smelled like disinfectant and something else, something faint and sour that clung to places where people came to die. Ruth's breathing was shallow, rattling in her chest like loose change in a tin can. The monitors beeped in a steady rhythm that felt both comforting and suffocating. "Grandma," Eliza said softly, leaning forward. "I gave him a note." Ruth's eyes opened slowly. They were pale blue, faded like old denim, but sharp. Always sharp. She turned her head slightly, focusing on Eliza with an intensity that made her granddaughter's chest tighten. "Did he read it?" Ruth's voice was barely a whisper, worn thin by years and illness. "Yes." And Eliza hesitated. She thought about the way Gideon Hale's face had crumbled, the way his hands had shaken, the way he'd looked at her like she'd just handed him the key to a door he'd spent his entire life trying to keep locked. He cried. Eliza said quietly, "Grandma, what did his grandmother do to your mother?" Ruth closed her eyes, and for a moment, Eliza thought she'd fallen back asleep. But then her grandmother's hand moved, reaching out with surprising strength to grip Eliza's wrist. Her fingers were cold, bony, but her grip was iron. "Some truths," Ruth whispered, "are too heavy to carry alone." "Then let me help you carry it," Eliza pleaded. "Tell me what happened. Please." Ruth's lips pressed into a thin line. She stared at the ceiling, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Your great-grandmother, Margaret, she was brilliant. She had ideas that could have changed everything. Patents, designs, things that would have made her a fortune." Her voice cracked, but she trusted the wrong person. "Gideon's grandmother?" Ruth nodded slowly. "Catherine Hale. They were partners once. friends even. But Catherine wanted more. She took Margaret's work, filed the patents under her own name, built an empire on stolen dreams. Eliza's stomach turned, and no one stopped her. Who would believe a poor woman over a Hale? Ruth's voice was bitter now, sharp with decades of anger. Margaret tried to fight, hired a lawyer with money she didn't have. But the Hales had connections, judges, politicians, people who owed them favors. She paused, her breathing labored. Margaret lost everything, her reputation, her business, her will to keep fighting. What happened to her? Ruth's eyes filled with tears. She died when I was 16. Heart attack, the doctor said, but I knew better. She died of a broken heart and a stolen life. Eliza felt her own tears coming. She thought about her mother, who'd left when Eliza was 8, chasing something better and never looking back. She thought about herself, working double shifts at a diner that barely paid enough to survive. Generations of women, each carrying the weight of the one before. Why didn't you tell me? Eliza whispered. Because I wanted you to have a different life, Ruth said, her voice breaking. I didn't want you to carry this rage, this poison that's been eating at me for 60 years. She gripped Eliza's wrist tighter. But when I heard he was back in Charleston, I knew it was time. We all paid for Hale's mercy, every single one of us. What do you mean, mercy? Ruth opened her mouth to answer, but then her body went rigid. Her eyes widened. Her grip on Eliza's wrist loosened and fell away. Grandma? Eliza's voice rose in panic. Grandma? The monitors began screaming. Nurses rushed in, shoving Eliza aside, their hands moving in practiced choreography. Someone shouted codes she didn't understand. Someone else pulled her toward the door. And Ruth Delaney, the last keeper of a 60-year-old secret, slipped into unconsciousness without finishing her sentence. Julian Cross arrived in Charleston on the first flight out of Boston. He was 58, built like a man who'd spent his youth in boxing rings and his adulthood in boardrooms. His salt and pepper hair was cropped short, his gray eyes perpetually calculating. He'd worked for the Hale family for 30 years, first as head of security, then as the man you called when problems needed to disappear quietly. He met Gideon in the hotel suite at dawn. The curtains were still drawn. Coffee sat untouched on the desk. Gideon looked like he hadn't slept, his eyes red-rimmed, his shirt untucked in a way that would have been unthinkable 24 hours ago. Tell me what you need, Julian said, settling into the leather chair across from him. Gideon slid a folder across the desk. Inside was the photograph, the one with his grandmother and Margaret Delaney, both young and smiling. I need you to find out everything about this woman. Margaret Delaney, born around 1940, lived in Charleston. Her daughter is Ruth Delaney, currently in Charleston Memorial Hospital. Julian studied the photograph, his expression unreadable. And what exactly are you looking for? The truth. Julian set the photograph down carefully. Gideon, I've worked for your family long enough to know that the truth isn't always something you want to find. I don't care what I want anymore, Gideon said quietly. I need to know what my grandmother did. Julian exhaled slowly. He'd been expecting this conversation for years. All right, give me 48 hours. It took him 36. When Julian returned, he carried a thin manila folder and an expression that made Gideon's stomach drop. They met in the hotel bar, empty except for a bartender wiping glasses at the far end. Julian ordered bourbon. Gideon didn't touch his drink. Margaret Delaney filed 3 patents in 1964. Julian began, his voice low. Revolutionary designs for microprocessor architecture, ahead of her time by at least a decade. He paused. 6 months later, Catherine Hale filed nearly identical patents under her own name. Gideon's jaw tightened. How? Partnership agreement. Margaret and Catherine had been working together on a startup, but the contract had a clause buried deep, written in legal language most people wouldn't catch. It gave Catherine rights to derivative works created during the partnership. Julian's expression darkened. Your grandmother's lawyers wrote it. Margaret didn't have legal representation when she signed. So it was theft. Legal theft, Julian corrected. The kind that ruins lives, but never sees a courtroom. Gideon felt sick. What happened to Margaret? She tried to fight it. spent what little money she had on a lawyer who couldn't compete with Hale resources. The case was dismissed. She lost her business, lost her home. Julian flipped to another page. She died in 1971. Heart failure. She was 46 years old. The room felt too small, too hot. Gideon loosened his tie, his hands shaking. And Ruth Delaney, Margaret's daughter, has been working low-wage jobs her entire life. Never married. Raised her granddaughter alone after her own daughter abandoned the family. Julian's voice softened. She's been in and out of hospitals for years. Can't afford proper care. Gideon closed his eyes. Generations. 3 generations of women paying for his grandmother's ambition. There's something else, Julian said, his tone shifting. I found correspondence between your father and Margaret Delaney from 1994. Letters. Dozens of them. Gideon's eyes snapped open. What? Your father knew, Julian said carefully. He'd been investigating what his mother did. He was planning to make it right. Transfer assets. Public acknowledgement. But then he disappeared. Julian leaned forward. Gideon, if this gets out, it'll ruin the Hales. Everything your family built is standing on stolen ground. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Gideon stood, walked to the window, and stared out at the city his grandmother had helped build with someone else's dreams. Somewhere out there, Ruth Delaney was dying. Somewhere out there, Eliza was trying to survive on scraps. I don't care about the empire anymore, Gideon said quietly. I care about what's right. Julian set down his glass. Then you'd better be ready for war. Gideon returned to Marion's diner 3 days later. This time, he didn't arrive in silence. This time, the bell above the door chimed, and he looked up, really looked, at the faded menu boards and the mismatched salt shakers, and the way the morning light slanted through the blinds in dusty golden bars. He looked like a man trying to remember how to be human. Eliza saw him from behind the counter and felt her heart lurch. She'd spent the last 72 hours at the hospital, watching monitors and holding her grandmother's hand and wondering if the note she'd delivered had been a terrible mistake. Ruth had stabilized, but barely. The doctor spoke in careful, measured tones that promised nothing. Gideon slid into the same booth by the window. Eliza approached slowly, coffee pot in hand, her guard up like a shield. I'm sorry, he said, before she could speak. His voice was different now, softer, stripped of its calculated polish. For the other day, for everything. Eliza poured his coffee without meeting his eyes. You don't owe me an apology. I think I do. He wrapped his hands around the mug, and she noticed they were still shaking slightly. I spent the last 3 days learning things about my family that I wish I didn't know. Things that explain why your grandmother gave you that note. She sat down across from him without asking permission. The diner was slow, just old Mr. Kellerman in the corner and a trucker at the counter nursing his 3rd refill. What did you find out? That my grandmother destroyed yours. The words came out flat, factual, like he was reading a balance sheet. Stole her work, buried her in legal paperwork, built an empire on someone else's dreams. He looked up and his eyes were hollow. Everything I have, it's built on theft. Eliza felt something twist in her chest. She'd expected anger, denial, lawyers and threats, not this quiet, broken honesty. My father knew, Gideon continued. He was trying to make it right before he disappeared. I think. He paused, his voice catching. I think that's why he's gone. The coffee between them had gone cold. Outside, dog barked. A car door slammed. Life continued, oblivious to the confessions happening in a cracked vinyl booth. I want to help, Gideon said. Your grandmother's medical bills. Whatever she needs. I can transfer funds today. Make sure she gets the best care available. Eliza's jaw tightened. No, he blinked surprised. I'm trying to do the right thing. The right thing. Her voice rose slightly, drawing a glance from Mr. Kellerman. She lowered it, leaning forward. You think you can just write a check and make 60 years of suffering disappear? You think money fixes what your family took from mine? I don't know what else to offer. The truth, Eliza said fiercely. Public acknowledgement. An apology that matters. Not some private transaction that lets you sleep better at night while keeping your empire intact. Gideon sat back, stung. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The fluorescent lights hummed. The grill sizzled. Ramon flipped pancakes with practiced efficiency, pretending not to listen. "You're right," Gideon said finally. "You're absolutely right." He ran a hand through his hair, and for the first time, he looked his age, 42, exhausted. Carrying the weight of crimes he didn't commit, but inherited anyway. "I've spent my whole life in boardrooms where everything has a price, where problems get solved with contracts and settlements. I don't know how to fix something like this." "Maybe it can't be fixed," Eliza said quietly. "Maybe all you can do is tell the truth and let the pieces fall where they will." He met her eyes, and something passed between them. Understanding, maybe, or just the shared recognition of two people standing at the edge of something that would change everything. "Your grandmother," he said. "Can I see her?" Eliza hesitated, then nodded. "Tomorrow, but I'm coming with you." Julian arrived at the hotel that evening with another folder, thicker this time, his expression carefully neutral. Gideon was pacing the suite, his phone in one hand, halfway through drafting a statement his legal team would hate. He looked up when Julian entered. "Tell me you found something good," Gideon said. Julian set the folder on the desk with more force than necessary. "I found something. Whether it's good depends on your definition." Gideon opened the folder. Inside were photocopies of letters, bank statements, legal documents. His eyes scanned quickly, his pulse quickening. "What am I looking at?" "Evidence that Ruth Delaney's husband, a man named Thomas Delaney, attempted to extort your grandmother in 1995. Julian's voice was flat professional. He threatened to go public with Margaret's story unless Catherine paid him $2 million. Gideon's stomach dropped. "That's not possible." "It's documented. Letters in his handwriting. A meeting arranged at a hotel in Atlanta. Your grandmother's legal team has records of the whole thing." Julian pulled out another page. "Catherine refused to pay. Thomas Delaney was arrested 3 months later on unrelated fraud charges. He died in prison in 1998. Gideon stared at the documents, his mind racing. This couldn't be right. It didn't match what he'd learned about Margaret, about Ruth, about the quiet dignity of a family that had endured decades of poverty without complaint. "So Ruth's family tried to blackmail mine?" Gideon said slowly. "That's what the evidence shows." Something felt wrong. Julian's tone was too careful, his posture too rigid. Gideon had known this man for decades, and right now, Julian looked like someone delivering a script he didn't believe. "You think this is real?" Gideon asked. Julian's jaw tightened. "I think it's what your legal team needs it to be." The words landed like a punch. Gideon's hands clenched. "What does that mean?" "It means," Julian said carefully, "that if you're planning to go public with what your grandmother did, this gives you an out, a counter-narrative. The Delaneys weren't innocent victims. They were opportunists who tried to profit from old wounds. And you believe that?" Julian was silent for a long moment. Then, "It doesn't matter what I believe. It matters what protects the company." Gideon wanted to throw the folder across the room, wanted to scream, but instead he sank into the chair. The documents spread before him like evidence at a trial. The letters looked real. The signatures matched. Everything was there, neat and damning. What if he'd been wrong? What if Ruth's note hadn't been about justice but about money? The doubt crept in like poison. When Gideon showed up at the diner the next morning, Eliza knew immediately something had changed. His face was closed off again, his shoulders tense. He slid the folder across the table without meeting her eyes. "You should see this," he said. She read in silence, her face going pale. Thomas Delaney, her grandfather, the man she'd never met because he'd been in prison when she was born. The man Ruth never talked about except in clipped, bitter sentences. "This is a lie," Eliza said, her voice shaking. "It's documented. I don't care what it says." She shoved the folder back at him. "My grandmother would never." "How do you know?" Gideon's voice was harsher than he intended. "You said yourself she kept secrets. What if this is one of them?" Eliza stood, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. Tears burned in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. "I know because I've spent my entire life watching her survive on nothing, watching her work herself to the bone, so I could eat. She could have asked you for money 1,000 times, but she didn't. She gave you the truth instead. Or she gave me bait," Gideon said quietly. The words hung between them like broken glass. Eliza looked at him, really looked, and saw not the man who'd cried over a note, but someone retreating behind the walls that money and power built. "Get out," she whispered. He didn't argue. He took a folder and left, the bell above the door chiming cheerfully as the space between them became an ocean neither knew how to cross. Eliza sat beside Ruth's hospital bed that night, her eyes red from crying, her hands wrapped around her grandmother's frail fingers. The monitors beeped their steady rhythm. The floor dripped. Outside, the Charleston sky had turned purple with dusk. "Grandma," Eliza whispered, "I need you to tell me about Grandpa Thomas." Ruth's eyes opened slowly. For a moment, she looked confused, lost in the fog of medication and memory. Then clarity returned, sharp and painful. "What did he tell you?" Ruth's voice was barely audible. "That Grandpa tried to blackmail the Hales." Ruth's breath caught. Her fingers tightened around Eliza's. "No," she whispered. "No, baby. That's not what happened." "Then tell me the truth, please." Ruth's eyes filled with tears. She looked so small in the hospital bed, so fragile, like she might disappear if Eliza stopped holding on. "Thomas tried to help me," she said, her words coming in gasps. "After Mama died, I told him everything. He was so angry. He wanted justice." She paused, struggling for breath. He went out to Catherine Hale, not to blackmail her, to demand she do the right thing. "What happened?" "She had him arrested." Ruth's voice cracked. "Planted evidence. Fraud charges that came out of nowhere. He went to prison, and I couldn't afford a good lawyer. Couldn't fight them." Tears slipped down her weathered cheeks. "He died there, Eliza, alone, because he tried to defend my mother's name." Eliza felt her world tilt. Everything Gideon had shown her, every document, every signature, had been a lie. A carefully constructed narrative designed to protect the Hales one more time. "It wasn't blackmail," Ruth whispered. "It was theft. All of it. They stole Mama's work, stole Thomas's freedom, stole our lives." Her breathing grew labored. "And I let you believe, let you think we were just poor because that's how life worked. But it wasn't fate, baby. It was murder. Slow and legal and dressed up in contracts." The machines started beeping faster. Ruth's grip loosened. "Grandma, stay with me," Eliza pleaded. Ruth reached beneath her pillow with trembling fingers and pulled out a small brass key. She pressed it into Eliza's palm, her hand cold and shaking. "Storage unit," Ruth gasped. "Number 47. Charleston South Storage. Everything's there. All the proof." "Proof of what?" "The patents. The letters. The real story." Ruth's eyes locked onto Eliza's, burning with an intensity that defied her failing body. "Promise me you'll finish this. Promise me you won't let them bury the truth again." "I promise," Eliza whispered, tears streaming down her face. Ruth smiled then, soft, peaceful, like a woman who'd finally set down a burden she'd carried too long. "Good girl," she breathed. "You were always stronger than me." The monitors began to scream. Nurses rushed in. Someone pulled Eliza back, but she kept her eyes on her grandmother, kept holding the key so tightly it cut into her palm. And Ruth Delaney, keeper of 60 years of stolen dreams, closed her eyes and let go. The last thought that crossed her mind was of her mother, young and smiling in that photograph, standing beside a friend who would betray her. She hoped Margaret was waiting, hoped they could finally rest. The monitors flatlined, the room filled with efficient, practiced grief. And in Eliza's hand, the key grew warm. The storage unit sat on the outskirts of Charleston, tucked behind a chain-link fence that rattled in the wind. Charleston South Storage was the kind of place people kept things they couldn't bear to throw away but couldn't stand to look at. Old furniture, boxes of photographs, the accumulated debris of lives that had shifted and changed. Unit 47 was in the back corner, its orange door streaked with rust and years of neglect. Eliza stood in front of it for a long moment, the brass key heavy in her hand. 3 days had passed since Ruth's funeral. 3 days of condolence casseroles she couldn't eat and sympathy cards from people who barely knew her grandmother. 3 days of feeling like she was drowning in a grief, so vast it had no edges. The key slid into the lock with a soft click. The door rolled up with a metallic groan. Inside, the unit was smaller than she'd expected, maybe 8 feet by 10, and surprisingly organized. No jumbled mess of forgotten belongings. Just a single wooden filing cabinet, a cardboard box sealed with packing tape, and a leather briefcase so old the corners had worn through to pale suede. Eliza stepped inside, her footsteps echoing. Dust motes danced in the shaft of afternoon light, spilling through the doorway. The air smelled like old paper and time itself, musty, patient waiting. She opened the filing cabinet first. Inside were folders, meticulously labeled in Ruth's careful handwriting. Patents, correspondence, legal documents, photographs, each folder thick with papers that someone had organized with the precision of a historian building a case. Eliza pulled out the patent folder. Inside were photocopies of 3 applications filed in 1964 under Margaret Delaney's name. The designs were complex. Circuit diagrams, technical specifications, pages of calculations written in her great-grandmother's neat hand. Eliza didn't understand most of it, but she recognized genius when she saw it. These weren't amateur sketches. These were blueprints for something revolutionary. Clipped to each patent was another document, identical in content but filed 6 months later under Catherine Hale's name. Side by side, they were damning. Not similar, identical. Every calculation, every diagram, every innovation that would eventually become the foundation of Hale Industries. Eliza's hands shook as she set them aside and reached for the correspondence folder. Letters between Margaret and Catherine, dated from 1962 to 1964. Early ones were warm, collaborative, full of excitement about their shared vision. "Together, we'll change the world," Catherine had written in one. "Your mind is brilliant, Margaret. I'm honored to work beside you." The later letters grew cooler, more businesslike, and then they stopped altogether. What came next were legal notices, cease and desist orders sent to Margaret Delaney, court summons, dismissal documents stamped with judges' signatures. And through it all, a pattern emerged. Margaret fighting alone against an army of Hale lawyers, her savings evaporating with each filing, her protests dismissed by men who saw a poor woman claiming ownership of ideas that a wealthy, connected woman had already monetized. Eliza found herself crying without realizing when it started. She wiped her eyes and opened the cardboard box. Inside were personal items, photographs of Margaret, young and vibrant, then older and worn, her eyes losing their light with each passing year. A wedding ring, a tarnished locket, and beneath it all, a stack of letters tied with string. These were different, personal, letters from Margaret to Ruth, written in the months before she died. "I failed you," one read. "I should have fought harder, should have been stronger. But they took everything, baby girl, everything except you." The last letter was dated 2 weeks before Margaret's death. The handwriting was shaky, trailing off at the edges. Someday, it read, "Someone will make this right. Maybe not in my lifetime, but truth has a way of surviving, even when everything else burns." Eliza set the letters down carefully and reached for the briefcase. Inside was a single document, protected in a clear plastic sleeve, a partnership agreement between Margaret Delaney and Catherine Hale, dated January 1963. Eliza read it slowly, her legal knowledge limited but her instinct sharp. There, buried in Section 12, Paragraph 4 was a clause. "All intellectual property developed during the course of partnership shall be considered joint ownership, with rights of individual filing granted to either party." It looked innocent, almost protective, but it was a trap. It meant Catherine could file patents without Margaret's permission, could claim sole ownership of ideas they'd developed together. And because Margaret had signed it without a lawyer, she'd handed over everything. Eliza sat back on her heels, surrounded by 6 decades of evidence. This wasn't just a family tragedy. This was systematic theft, premeditated, calculated, the kind of crime that wore a suit and smiled while it destroyed you. She pulled out her phone and took photographs of everything, every patent, every letter, every piece of proof that the Hale empire was built on ground that wasn't theirs to claim. Then she called the one person who needed to see this. Even though he'd betrayed her, she called Gideon. Gideon met Julian in the hotel suite at midnight. He'd asked him to come alone, and Julian had agreed without question, the way he always did, the way he had for 30 years. But tonight, something was different. Tonight, Gideon had spent 6 hours in a storage unit reading letters written by a dead woman. and every word had been a knife twisting deeper. Julian walked in looking tired, his suit jacket draped over his arm, his expression guarded. "You sounded urgent," he said, pouring himself a drink from the bar cart without asking. "What's going on?" Gideon stood by the window, his back to the room. The Charleston skyline glittered below, a city built on history and secrets, beauty and blood. "I need you to tell me the truth," he said quietly. "About Thomas Delaney." Julian's hand paused halfway to his mouth. "We already discussed this." "No." Gideon turned, and his face was carved from stone. "You gave me documents. I'm asking you, as someone I've trusted my entire adult life, to tell me the truth." The silence stretched between them, fragile and dangerous. Julian set down his glass carefully, like a man handling explosives. "What do you want me to say? That you didn't fabricate evidence to protect my family?" Julian's jaw tightened. For a moment, he looked older than his 58 years, worn down by decades of cleaning up other people's messes, of choosing loyalty over conscience. So many times he'd forgotten the difference. "Thomas Delaney was a threat," Julian said finally. "He was going to ruin everything your grandmother built. By telling the truth. By destroying your family's reputation over something that happened 30 years before you were even born." Julian's voice rose. "What good would it have done, Gideon? Margaret Delaney was dead. The patents were filed. The company was thriving. Dragging it all into the light wouldn't have helped anyone." "It would have helped Ruth," Gideon said, his voice shaking with barely controlled rage. "It would have helped Eliza. It would have given them justice instead of poverty." "Justice doesn't pay for food," Julian shot back. "Justice doesn't keep companies afloat and thousands of people employed. Your grandmother made a choice, a hard choice, and I made sure it stayed buried because that's what I was hired to do." "You framed an innocent man." Julian flinched, but didn't look away. "I protected your family. By lying to me." Gideon stepped forward, and his hands were clenched so tight his knuckles had gone white. "I came to you 3 days ago and asked for the truth. You looked me in the eye and gave me fabricated documents. You made me doubt Eliza, made me doubt Ruth. You let me walk away from the one person who'd been honest with me since this started. Because you were going to destroy everything." Julian's composure cracked, his voice raw. "You were going to go public, hand over assets, burn down an empire because of guilt. I couldn't let you do that. It wasn't your choice to make." "Yes, it was." Julian's voice dropped to something cold and final. "Your father tried to do the same thing. Tried to make it right. And look what happened to him." The words landed like a gunshot. Gideon's breath stopped. The room tilted. "What did you say?" Julian closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, they were full of something that looked like grief. "Your father didn't disappear, Gideon. He was removed." The floor seemed to fall away beneath Gideon's feet. By who? By people who understood that some secrets are worth protecting. Julian's voice was barely a whisper. "I didn't know until it was too late. I swear to you I didn't know. But afterward, I made sure no one else would try." Gideon staggered backward, his hand gripping the edge of the desk. His father, who'd been kind and gentle and troubled. His father, who'd received letters every Christmas and locked himself in his study to read them. His father, who'd disappeared when Gideon was 12 and never came home. "You knew," Gideon breathed. "All these years you knew he was murdered, and you said nothing." "I kept you safe," Julian said desperately. "If you'd started asking questions, if you'd gone looking for answers, I deserved the truth. The truth would have killed you too." The words echoed in the silence. Julian stood there, his face pale, his carefully constructed armor finally shattered. For 30 years, he'd carried this secret. For 30 years, he'd chosen protection over honesty, survival over justice. Gideon looked at him. This man who'd taught him how to tie a tie, who'd been at his college graduation, who'd stood beside him through every major decision of his adult life, and saw a stranger. "Get out," Gideon said quietly. "Gideon, get out of my sight before I call the police and tell them everything." Julian opened his mouth, then closed it. He picked up his jacket, walked to the door, and paused with his hand on the handle. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice breaking. "For what it's worth, I'm sorry." The door closed behind him with a soft click, and Gideon Hale, heir to an empire built on theft and murder, sank to his knees and finally let himself break. Eliza was wiping down tables when he walked in. It was early, too early for customers, the sun barely cresting the horizon. She looked up and froze, the rag still in her hand, her guard snapping into place like armor. Gideon looked different, smaller somehow, despite his height. His eyes were red-rimmed, his suit rumpled like he'd slept in it. He carried a folder, not the one Julian had given him, but the one filled with letters Eliza had shown him from the storage unit. "I'm sorry," he said. His voice cracked on the words. "I'm so sorry." Eliza said nothing, just stood there waiting. Gideon set the folder on the counter and opened it. Ruth's letters to Margaret. Margaret's letters to Ruth. 60 years of pain preserved in ink and paper. He picked up the first one, his hands trembling, and began to read aloud. "My dearest Ruth, I failed you." His voice broke, but he kept going. "I should have fought harder, should have been stronger. But they took everything, baby girl. Everything except you." Tears slipped down his face. He read the next letter, and the next, his voice growing stronger with each word. He read about Margaret's dreams, about her belief that innovation could change the world, about the day Catherine Hale betrayed her and how it felt like watching the sun go out. Eliza's own tears came quietly, falling onto the counter she'd been wiping. She thought about Ruth, about her grandmother's tired hands and fierce pride, about the weight she'd carried alone for so long. When Gideon finished the last letter, he looked up. "My family destroyed yours," he said. "Not just once, but over and over again. My grandmother stole your great-grandmother's dreams. My company had your grandfather killed. And his voice broke again. "I doubted you when you told me the truth. Why are you here?" Eliza whispered, "Because I want to make it right." Gideon wiped his eyes. Not with money, not with silence, with the truth. All of it, public, documented, whatever cost me. For the first time in days, Eliza felt something shift in her chest. Not forgiveness, not yet, but maybe the beginning of it. "Okay," she said quietly, "then let's burn it all down." Outside, the sun broke through the clouds, spilling gold across the diner floor. The press conference was held in the ballroom of the Charleston Harbor Hotel, the same building where Catherine Hale had once celebrated the launch of Hale Industries' first major product line. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. 200 journalists packed the room, cameras pointed at the podium like weapons. The air hummed with anticipation, and the click of shutters firing in rapid succession. Gideon stood backstage, his hands folded behind his back, staring at his reflection in a mirror streaked with age. He wore a simple navy suit, no tie, no cufflinks worth more than a car payment. Just a man about to dismantle everything he'd inherited. Eliza stood beside him, wearing a black dress Ruth had bought her for job interviews she'd never gotten. She looked scared but resolute, her jaw set in a way that reminded him of her grandmother. "You don't have to do this," she said quietly. "Yes," Gideon replied, "I do." When he walked onto the stage, the room fell silent. Every major news outlet was represented. Financial reporters, technology journalists, even tabloid photographers hoping for a scandal. They had no idea how deep this one went. Gideon stepped to the microphone. No notes, no teleprompter. Just a truth he'd spent 30 years not knowing. "My name is Gideon Hale," he began, his voice steady despite the tremor in his chest. "And I'm here to tell you that the company I built my life around was founded on theft." The room erupted. Questions shouted over one another. Camera flashes created a strobe effect that felt like lightning. Gideon raised a hand, and slowly, the chaos settled into stunned silence. He told them everything. About Margaret Delaney and the patents she'd filed. About Catherine Hale's betrayal disguised as partnership. About Thomas Delaney's murder dressed up as prison justice. About his own father's disappearance and the conspiracy that had protected the Hale name for 60 years. He showed them the documents, projected them on screens behind him. Margaret's original patents beside Catherine's identical copies. Letters proving the timeline. Legal documents proving the theft. "I cannot undo what was done," Gideon said, his voice thick with emotion. "I cannot bring back the lives that were stolen or the dreams that were buried. But I can tell the truth. And I can make sure that the woman whose genius built this empire is finally recognized. He paused, looking directly into the cameras. Effective immediately, I am dissolving the Catherine Hale Foundation and establishing the Margaret Delaney Innovation Fund. Every patent originally filed under my grandmother's name will be retroactively credited to Margaret Delaney. Her descendants will receive the royalties they should have inherited decades ago. The room exploded again. Some reporters looked stunned. Others looked hungry, already crafting headlines. Financial analysts were typing furiously, calculating the stock impact. But Gideon wasn't finished. And to Ruth Delaney, he said, his voice breaking, who spent her entire life carrying the weight of injustice, I'm sorry. I'm sorry it took so long. I'm sorry you died before seeing this moment. But your granddaughter is here, and she will make sure your mother's name is remembered. He stepped back from the podium as questions erupted like thunder. Security moved to escort him off stage, but he paused, looking out at the sea of faces. Sometimes, he said into the microphone, the hardest thing a family can do is admit it was wrong. The next morning, Hale Industries stock dropped 40%. Gideon didn't check the numbers. He was too busy keeping a promise. 6 months later, Marion's Diner reopened on a bright October morning. The bell above the door had been polished until it gleamed. The cracked vinyl booths had been reupholstered in deep red leather. The floors no longer stuck to your shoes, and the coffee, finally, didn't taste like regret. But the soul of the place remained unchanged. The same fluorescent lights hummed their familiar tune. The same jukebox sat in the corner, now restored and playing songs from decades past. The same menu board hung behind the counter, though the prices had been lowered and the portions increased. Above the register, in a simple wooden frame, hung the note that had started everything. 6 words written in Ruth's shaky handwriting. I know what your grandmother did to my mother. Eliza stood behind the counter, pouring coffee for Mr. Kellerman, who'd returned on opening day like he'd never left. She wore her grandmother's old apron, the one with faded flowers embroidered along the hem, and for the first time in years, she felt something close to peace. The door chimed, and Gideon walked in carrying a box of fresh pastries from the bakery down the street. He'd moved to Charleston permanently, trading his penthouse in Manhattan for a modest townhouse 3 blocks from a diner. The board of directors had accepted his resignation. The media had moved on to newer scandals, and he discovered something surprising. He preferred burnt coffee and honest conversation to boardrooms and quarterly earnings. Morning, he said, setting the pastries on the counter. You're late, Eliza replied, but she was smiling. Traffic was terrible. All 3 cars on Main Street were going the speed limit. She laughed, a real laugh, the kind that came easy now. They'd spent the last 6 months rebuilding more than just a diner. They'd rebuilt trust, friendship, something that felt like family, though neither would say it out loud yet. The Margaret Delaney Innovation Fund had awarded its first grants last month. 5 women entrepreneurs working on technology that could change lives. Ruth would have loved it. Margaret would have been proud. Gideon had kept his word about everything. The patents were corrected. The royalties transferred. Eliza had more money than she knew what to do with, so she'd done what Ruth would have wanted. Invested it back into the community. Scholarships for local students. Grants for small businesses. A memorial garden behind the public library with Margaret's name etched in stone. But this, the diner, reopened and thriving. This felt like the truest memorial of all. Your grandmother would be proud, Gideon said quietly, looking up at the framed note. So would yours, Eliza replied. The version of her that existed before she chose ambition over friendship. It was the closest either of them could come to forgiveness for people they'd never known, but whose choices had shaped their entire lives. The morning crowd began to filter in. Construction workers ordering breakfast plates. Office workers grabbing coffee to go. Retirees claiming their usual booths. The diner filled with the sounds of life, conversation and laughter, and the sizzle of bacon on the grill. Eliza looked around at the place her grandmother had worked for 30 years, the place that had survived poverty and loss, and the weight of buried secrets. It looked different now, brighter. But the heart of it, the warmth, the welcome, the sense that everyone who walked through that door mattered, that remained exactly the same. Outside, the Charleston sun climbed higher, casting golden light through the windows. The bell chimed again. Another customer, another story, another chance to do what Ruth and Margaret never could. Build something that couldn't be stolen. And on the wall, the note hung in its frame, not as a reminder of pain, but as proof that truth, no matter how long buried, always finds its way home. Sometimes justice doesn't arrive with thunder and lightning. Sometimes it doesn't wear a black robe or carry a gavel. Sometimes it comes quietly, in a note slipped across a diner table, in a truth finally spoken, in a granddaughter refusing to let her family's story die in silence. This wasn't a fairy tale. There was no perfect ending where everything broken became whole again. Ruth never lived to see her mother's name restored. Margaret never saw her daughter freed from poverty's grip. Thomas never walked out of that prison to hold his family again. But Eliza stood in a diner that bore her grandmother's legacy. Gideon dismantled an empire built on lies and started building something honest in its place. And somewhere in whatever comes after, 3 generations of Delaney women finally rested. The truth didn't erase 60 years of suffering. It didn't return stolen time or heal wounds that had scarred over decades. But it did something else, something perhaps more important. It proved that silence, no matter how carefully maintained, eventually shatters. That power, no matter how vast, cannot bury conscience forever. That ordinary people, armed with nothing but truth and courage, can topple empires built on sand. Would you have had the strength to hand that note to a billionaire? Would you have risked everything to expose a family secret buried for generations? And if you discovered that everything you'd built was standing on stolen ground, would you have the courage to burn it down and start over? These aren't easy questions. They're the kind that keep you awake at night, that challenge everything you thought you knew about loyalty and justice and the price of doing what's right. If you believe hidden truths deserve to see daylight, that stolen dreams should be returned to their rightful owners, then this story was for you. Subscribe so you never miss another true story that proves ordinary courage can change everything.